Hello, welcome to World Civilizations since 1500. Now, this is session 2 of the ninth topic of the semester titled Globalization and Its Many Worlds. Now, in this session, what we're going to be doing is continuing to look at the rise of the American century. Something we started looking at in session 1 when we were looking at the 19th century, the second industrial revolution in the United States. We're going to see a new type of industry on the rise that applied modern science and technology in the area of production and also in the area of management, again, workers' management as well. We were also looking at the rise of consumerism in the late 19th, early 20th centuries as a way that American industrialists were trying to cope and deal with the issue of overproduction. They wanted to create an internal mass market inside of the United States that will be willing to absorb the excess goods coming out from industries, and at the same time, they're going to pursue foreign markets as well in order to deal with this problem of overproduction. So this is going to lead to the transformation of the United States from a merchant republic into a corporate empire. And the first area, again, of economic imperialism, so to speak, occurred in Latin America. We were looking at that, how Americans are moving into Mexico, Central America, parts of South America, the Caribbean, and American companies are, during this time, dominating more and more significant elements of those economies of Latin America. We were also mentioning that the Americans are not just there for the purpose of extracting resources and capital, but rather that at the same time that they're doing that, they're also there to spread the American system, American cultural values and ideas. So if we can just go to our outline here, we were looking just quite briefly here, if you recall, at, again, the attempt of American companies to bring modernity into Latin America. Latin America was still largely traditional. And again, they're going to introduce some of the ideas I was discussing at the end of session 1, like the ideas of change, preparing societies for the arrival of industries. So they will change their traditions, their way of life, and embrace the new, to become more individualistic, to think of their own self-interest instead of the interest of the community, in order to, prepare that society for the arrival of capitalism, which is a very individualistic system that is totally centered on competition, not cooperation. Again, so they're trying to create a capitalist culture or create an environment that will be more receptive to capitalism, because capitalism is predicated on the idea that individuals are competing with one another over resources, jobs, education, and so on in society, and this is going to foster growth, personal growth, and personal progress. The idea of consumerism. Again, if you are going to bring industries into different parts of the world, it is also essential that you bring the value into those societies, that the way that we find happiness and fulfillment in this life is by consumption. So again, the American mission in Latin America was also very much bringing with it American corporations, this idea that, again, consumerism is the way that we find ourselves in this world, and we can find and fulfill our desires and enhance our happiness as well. And the idea of materialism, if you recall, I was also discussing how Americans are also bringing the idea that the way we measure progress, the way we measure growth, is by the amount of material output, material accomplishments, again, that a society produces. Whether in the world of economics, whether in the world of sports, whether we're talking about, for example, in the world of agriculture, in the world of infrastructure development. If we find, for example, a society that has roads and railroads and ports and the like, transportation systems, that is how we measure, progress in any given society. And this is important because still, not only Latin America, but around the world, there are societies that measure progress and growth, not so much in material gain or accomplishment, but rather in spiritual accomplishments. If we are indeed more peaceful, if a society produces, for example, wise individuals, if we are harmonious, if we find connectedness with nature or with spirit and so on, what's called spirituality. Some societies value more that, again, than materialism. But again, this is one of the essential elements that American companies particularly are bringing with them into Latin America. And it is here that I want to connect this issue with the American mission in Latin America. That is that U.S. corporations and also Protestant missionaries are going to be moving into Latin America during this period of time, let us say the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with this mission that they were there to transform those societies, to Americanize them, to spread American values, the ones that I just mentioned. And just as a case study, I just want to name two different countries here and explain how this process was carried out very briefly. For example, in Mexico. We see that when American industries began arriving in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, particularly in places like South Mexico, because those societies were very, very traditional, rooted in Catholic traditions. They carried out significant ritualistic practices and ceremonies devoted to their patron saints and virgins. There were religious festivals, fiestas, that will span for many, many days during the year. And in fact, there were so many of them that altogether they will spend about half of the year carrying out those ceremonies. Again, because every month there was a different deity, there was a different saint, and so on that they needed to pay homage to. So when those American industries arrived, they faced the difficulty that, look, people are not really showing up at the job because they have other responsibilities, other communitarian responsibilities. They have to perform all those festivals and so on because they're Catholic. So one way to change that was by sending in Protestant missionaries to try to convert those societies in south of Mexico, in central Mexico, to the Protestant faith, because under Protestantism, again, you abandon all beliefs about saints and virgins, and there's only, in this case, just one God that you need to be concerned with. So there's no need to carry out so many festivals and ceremonies because there's only one God. And in fact, under Protestantism, the idea is that this one God wants you to prosper in this world. This idea of the prosperity gospel, for example, that you need to work hard, you need to be disciplined, you need to find a job and attain economic success, you need to be responsible, and so on. This is what God wants you to do. This is your religious duty, in other words. So again, we see the arrival of Protestant missionaries in Mexico for the purpose of converting the population in preparation for the arrival of industrial capitalism. Again, so people can indeed take their job serious and be there from Monday to Friday at the established schedule and feel the responsibility to be there because now they're Protestant, in other words. So this is what God wants them to do. There's also the idea that the industrial management are introducing the rationalization of production. This idea of micromanagement. This idea that, look, once you bring in people to work in a factory, you need to micromanage the labor force. This idea that people are going to be in charge of the workplace. They're going to work at their own pace, or they're going to have a significant say in the process of production. Again, this is something that is not going to be allowed, because now the American system, again, has a very scientific way of managing the workforce. So this is another way that they're trying to change the way people think about work as well, that there is a class of supervisors and managers, an industrial class, a managerial class, that is going to be doing the analysis and the planning for the workers, and that the workers must comply in this regard, because this is the scientific way, this is the rational way of doing work. Again, so this is in sharp contrast with the way that those societies operated, in which this is a society of artisans, and artisans are pretty much in control of their own tools, they're in control of their own shops, they work at their own pace, and they're going to feel that in this environment they're losing control of all of that, again, because this is the system that is being introduced during this time in Mexico, and also in other areas of Latin America as well. Mexico is not the exception, but rather this is going to be the kind of the set pattern for all the other countries that will see the arrival of American corporations. Now in Cuba, we talked about Cuba. Cuba becomes a sort of protectorate of the United States after 1903, after the Spanish-American War. Not a colony by any means. So the United States will allow Cuba to be self-governed, with the condition that internally Cuba has to be open for American interest, American companies, American corporations to move in there, and buy land and run factories or industries and the like. Now, it is during this time that a General Leonard Wood, who was placed in charge of the island just at the time when the Spanish lost the war, he was going to be there to prepare the very first transition government of Cuba to take effect. And when he was there, his grand vision for Cuba was for Cuba to become just like the United States, that this will be an Anglo-Saxon republic, in other words. Again, so he's not just there to make sure that there will be a peaceful transition of power, the creation of a Cuban government, etc., but rather that, that Americans are going to be much shaping Cuban culture in the future to transform and shape the mindset of Cubans, so they will start thinking just like Americans, for example. In this case, the idea was to create a series of institutions that will help the peoples of Cuba imitate, in this case, emulate the material progress that the United States had attained. Yeah. In what way? Well, for example, American institutions like financial institutions, this idea of mortgages, for example, that you can borrow money, for example, to invest it in land, and you have a mortgage on your land, for example. That this is the way. It's called finance capital, for instance, that if you are to open a business, a shop, a factory, if you want to buy more land, etc., that the way to do this is by attending a financial institution, borrowing money, and having a mortgage, in other words, on that property, in you're paying off that property again through your business activities and so on. Again, kind of creating an entrepreneurial, if you will, kind of environment in Cuba in which finance capital plays a key role here. Also, the formation of schools. They're going to create new public school systems in Cuba, the Americans in this case, and train about 3,000 teachers to not only educate the peoples of Cuba in, for example, normal disciplines like mathematics and history and geography and so on, but rather that they will impart to the peoples of Cuba certain values, the American way, if you will, of thinking, the American system. Everything we discussed, for example, in session one, this idea of perfectibility, for example, progress, and so on. That those ideas need to be taught to the peoples of Cuba, so they will be Americanized. In other words, during their stay in school. Also, the creation of courts. The courts in Cuba function very, very differently under Spanish law. Here, what we see is the introduction of the type of American courts in which people are going to be judged by their peers, by a jury, for example, jury trial, and so on. So people will start, identifying themselves with the American way of life, with the American legal system, and they're going to function in this way in the near future. So they are indeed trying to, prepare the population for the arrival of industrial capitalism. And indeed, one of the things that occurred is precisely that American corporations, like, for example, United Fruit Company, arrives into the island, and they're going to become one of the major players in the sugar industry in the region. Also, General Electric, taking charge of electricity and other utilities as well. And Citibank of New York is going to, at the same time, take also charge of financial industry, not to mention their eventual participation in buying up some industrial mills, sugar mills as well. And there'll be a host of other American companies. Those were perhaps the major companies that are moving into Cuba. And again, what we see is the gradual Americanization of Cuban culture. Again, so this is, again, two just quick examples of how American corporations are spreading the American system into Latin America. Now, the last portion of looking at the American century is perhaps one of the most important ones, and that is the rise of the United States in the 20th century to the world stage, becoming really the world superpower, particularly as we're going to be moving into, for example, the Second World War, and after that, the United States will become really the world superpower by that time. It will be challenged, of course, by another power, but again, it will have the largest economy and the largest military by far. So step by step, how this process evolved. Well, they're already in Latin America, as we mentioned, of course, but what really launched the United States to the world stage was indeed a conflict that occurred from 1914 to 1918, a conflict that we already covered, and that is World War I. Now, we're not going to get into the U.S. participation in the war per se here. What is very significant to note, however, is that this conflict, World War I, provided the opportunity for the United States to emerge as one of the leading creditor nations to the world, particularly to the Europeans. And this is very important because Europe was really the center of political, economic, military, and financial power, as a matter of fact. Even the stock market was headquartered in London prior to the end of this war. So it is really Europe, the center of world hegemony. And when the war began, the Allies, in this case Great Britain and France, requested loans from the United States to fight the Germans. And the United States loaned the British particularly billions of dollars, again, to sustain the British economy and to purchase also war materials to be used to fight the Germans, and so on. So towards the end of this conflict, the British economy was severely weakened, whereas the American economy was strengthened, particularly the financial sector in this case. The United States went from a debtor nation to a creditor, lender nation. It will become one of the major financial outlets for the European powers. So much so that in order to compensate for a fraction of that debt, the British were willing to transfer the stock market, which was centered in London, to transfer it to New York in 1919. So now the United States is becoming the center of financial power in the world. Again, so this is the beginning stages of that. Again, World War I really set the stage for the rise of the United States as a world superpower. Okay. Now, during the 1920s, due to the fact that the European economies had been devastated by the war, we see trouble in Europe, but here in the United States, what we see is massive economic growth taking place. This is a decade in the United States history known as the Roaring Twenties. Industrial production skyrocketed. We mentioned that by 1924, the United States was producing about 46% of the world's goods. Keep that in mind, just in 1924. So the 1920s was a decade to remember in U.S. history. It was a massive industrial expansion, exports skyrocketed as well, and also American corporations increased their investments and presence in Latin America as well, during this decade as well. Okay, so the United States economy was really growing and moving outwards at the same time. Okay, so this is yet another stepping stone for the growth of the United States as a world superpower. Now, the 1930s can be seen as a kind of setback for the United States and the U.S. economy, that's for sure. However, despite this massive setback, which it was, the stock market crashed in 1929. In the United States, we see massive unemployment, the foreclosure of banks. About 9,000 banks are going to fail in the United States. So again, it was really a massive crisis. But during this time, there were a series of policies that aimed to get the United States out of the Great Depression, and at the same time that they were trying to rekindle the U.S. economy here at home. Those policies, known simply as the New Deal, also involve preparing the stage for U.S. companies to start moving more and more into the international arena as well. Again, to the United States to cease being simply a regional power, but rather to start really aiming at becoming a global power. Again, so this New Deal program established by FDR, Roosevelt, involved really an alliance, and it was called the Triple Alliance to save capitalism. And this alliance was the alliance not only that Roosevelt, but the federal government in general was making with two very important actors of the U.S. economy. In this case, big tech, the big technical or technological industries, for example, like IBM, General Electric, for example, Rockefeller, oil refinery industries, and the like. And also an alliance with labor, with the labor movement. Again, so the labor movement is going to be included into this alliance. Again, and this alliance was to save capitalism. In other words, that look, that in the past, those actors were not really working in concert necessarily, but now they are going to be working in concert for common purposes. And one of those common purposes was to save the system. In other words, to save capitalism. And that was a big threat in this case in the United States. in terms of a growing internal movement of, for example, socialists and communists, again, that saw pretty much an opening, an opportunity to replace capitalism with a more socialistic or more communistic, if you will, system. So to prevent that, Roosevelt, along with big tech and labor, came together in order to revamp the system, so to speak. In other words, that in order to appease the labor movement here at home, so they will abandon, for example, communism and work in unison with big business and the federal government, that social welfare, and social security, for example, particularly, was going to be provided. That, again, that there should not be any struggle between capital and labor in the United States. That, look, what we're going to do is make sure that workers in the United States are treated well, that they have a 8-hour working day, a living wage as well, that they have also benefits and also unemployment benefits, health insurance and the like, and of course pensions and social security and the like, social welfare, in other words. And in return, the labor movement will have to get rid of those radical elements, within the movement, like communism and the like. Now, that appeases, in this case, labor, but what about big business? In this case, big tech. Big tech also wants concessions, and what they want is really a more opening for foreign markets. They want to compete in the world stage for resources and markets as well, and they want the aid of the federal government. They want internationalism, in other words, okay? Not just in Latin America. No, they're really thinking about Europe, they're thinking about Asia and the like. Again, global, in other words. So, this is the alliance that is created to save the system, and the alliance entail, once again, appeasing the labor force and the labor movement here at home, and also kind of providing opportunities and help and cover for big business abroad as well. Okay, so this is going to further increase American presence overseas, because now American corporations are moving around the world, and they're being aided, they're being covered, if you will, by not only the federal government, but they also have the full support of the labor movement in the United States as well. And in addition to that, we see the formation of certain private associations that are going to be promoting, for example, education within the United States, but also overseas, in order to spread American values as well. So again, the Rockefeller and Ford Foundation sponsor, for example, scholarships and fellowships and grants, and provides educational facilities and the like, in order to spread American values for the arrival, if you will, of American companies in different parts of the world. So again, this is very, very important, that during the 1930s, what we see is yet another stepping stone being placed for the emergence of the United States as a world superpower. And finally, the final stage that completed this transformation was the Second World War. The Second World War was far more shattering to the Allies than the First World War. Okay, France was actually conquered by the Germans and occupied for most of World War II, and also Great Britain was largely devastated by the German air raids to British cities, which were totally devastated as well. And what we see is a very, very weak British Empire that depended totally on the US for help and aid. And so what really got the United States out of the Great Depression was really World War II. What we see is that the American economy was now kicked in to full gear because there was the need to supply weaponry and war materials to the Allies fighting Hitler during the Second World War, and also the United States is going to be fighting Japan in the Pacific, and the American economy transformed itself into a war-based economy because of World War II. So we see, once again, industrial production on the rise, and millions of jobs are created, and this is going to lead to the United States developing really the largest economy and also the largest military as well in the world. Okay, so it was really World War II that created finally really the American empire, the one that is now going to spread its ideas around the world more and more fully, just because, again, at the end of the Second World War, we see the devastation of Europe, the fall of the conventional empires like the British Empire is already falling, the French Empire is also falling, Germany was devastated, and of course, what remained in Europe was a very strong state that is also on its way to expand and acquire imperial status as well, and is going to compete with the United States for influence around the world. And it is here that we're going to see in part 2 precisely this rivalry, this competition, particularly after the end of the Second World War, between two great world superpowers that are going to be competing around the world in order to spread their own system. They have very different systems, by the way, and trying to convince other nations that their system was the best in this case, that this is the way that you achieve development. All right, so it is here where we're going to see the rivalry between those two world superpowers. One was the United States, and the other one was the Soviet Union. And this rivalry was called, and has been termed ever since, as the Cold War. Okay, the Cold War. It is the rivalry, the competition between two world superpowers that are competing on the world stage to convince nations around the world that their system is the best system to achieve economic development. Okay, so this is what we're going to be doing here in part 2. It's called the Cold War and Alternative Models of Development. So it is very, very important to note that the 20th century is a very unique period of time in human history, in that nations around the world were not just interested to achieve economic development for just the purpose of doing so, but rather that they were also trying to create an ideal society, a sort of like utopia. What is really the ideal way that human beings can live on Earth to achieve maximum happiness? This is the central question. This is what really given rise to ideologies, for example, capitalism or socialism or communism, for instance. Those isms, everything that ends on an ism is an ideology, is a way of thinking about, for example, society, or thinking about the economy, or thinking about politics for that matter, but rather that it's not just a way of thinking about them, but rather it is a way of looking at those systems as systems that will bring the ideal society in which people, once again, will achieve maximum fulfillment and maximum human happiness at the same time. So this is what the Cold War actually entailed. Again, that there is going to be competing worldviews, competing ideologies, in which each party thinks that their way of organizing the economy is going to create the ideal society, utopia. And this is what a utopia is, like this perfect world, this perfect community where people are going to be happy, where their needs are going to be provided, and they're going to be finding fulfillment in what they're doing, either in their work or in their economic activities or in consumption and whatever else. Again, that they believe that this is how we create an earthly paradise. Okay? An earthly paradise. Paradise on earth, in other words. Okay? So again, I want to make sure that you understand that the Cold War was not just a matter of trying to impose an ideology, but rather this became also a sort of like a religious crusade in which people are defending their ideas, their beliefs about their economic philosophy, in this case, believing that this is how we attain a paradise here on earth. Okay? This is how we create a heavenly earth. Again, it took almost like a religious kind of overtone. Consider, for example, the fact that for most of human history, people have been fighting over religion, fighting over ideas of God, for example, killing each other in the name of God, for instance. But the 20th century is the century of modern science and technology. People have abandoned to a certain degree the religious ideas of the past. This is the era of secularism, where people are more concerned with the here and the now, this world, and the necessities of this world. Okay? So instead of waiting for a heavenly world after death, instead of waiting for a paradise after death, people are trying to create a heaven and a paradise here in this world. Okay? Trying to create a kind of society that will mirror the kind of paradise life that people in the past were dreaming about. And that led to the rise of ideologies. So instead of people fighting over religion, the way they have been fighting for many, many centuries in the past, now the 20th century is when human beings are going to be fighting over ideology. Again, ideology is quickly replacing religion as the number one source for human conflict, again, in the world. Okay? So, now, I wanted to get that out of the way because this is really what is so characteristic, so distinct of the 20th century. Now, we have two world superpowers at the end of the Second World War. Okay? The United States and the Soviet Union. And each superpower have their own ideology, their own model for developing a country, for developing a society, developing an economy, for example. But why this struggle is going to become so central and so important after the Second World War, and so much that is going to become really a Cold War, it is because after the end of the Second World War, there were many nations around the world that were devastated and shattered from the war itself. So they were in need to reconstruct their countries to begin with. How are we going to rebuild our countries from the ashes of the war, they will say. Okay, how are we going to attain reconstruction? Are we going to rebuild our country so we can become, for example, like the United States, and we'll have a capitalist society, a capitalist economy? Or are we going to rebuild our country and reshape it so we can look like the Soviet Union, so we can have a communist society with a communist state? Which of those two? Yeah, so this is the struggle. This is going to be really at the very heart of the struggle of the Cold War. Again, this is something that many regions of the world needed to decide. Europe, most importantly, I will say, because Europe was really totally devastated. Many areas of Europe were totally destroyed. It was a wasteland, really, that will require billions of dollars to actually rebuild. Asia as well was largely shattered. Latin America was not necessarily affected by the war. Africa, some areas were affected, but rather Latin America and Africa, the issue was more about how do we achieve modernity? How do we modernize our economies? They were trying to achieve development. And they were also in a crossroads trying to decide, particularly after the end of the Second World War, which road to take. Okay, the capitalist road or the communist road, for example. Okay, and as we'll see, it will be particularly Latin America and other areas of the so-called third world that will opt to follow a different route, a different alternative. They are going to create their own alternative models of development, different types of worlds, in other words, not the capitalist world, not the communist world, but rather their own world. So this is one of the reasons why I titled this topic as Globalization and its many worlds. This is exactly what we're seeing here, is the formation of many different kinds of worlds in the planet. Now, let's start with the American model. Again, what the American model presented to the world. What Americans advertised, in other words. What kind of world they were offering. So, nations would reconstruct themselves, or they will achieve modernity. They will say you can do reconstruction or modernization by following the American way, the American model. And they call themselves the first world, as a matter of fact. So again, the Cold War is going to give rise to this lingo, the terminology of the different worlds. On one hand, we have, for example, the first world that the United States pretty much embodied quite fully. And the first world was a world in which people are born on planet Earth and live under specific kinds of political systems. In this case, they live under liberal democracies. Now, in other words, that they have representative forms of government, that people have civil liberties, rights protected by the Constitution, and that there's a system of elections, and that people go and vote people in and out of office and the like. They elect the representatives at the local, state, and federal level and the like. At the same time, people living in the first world live in particular kinds of economies that are characterized by capitalism, in which people are allowed to own property, create businesses. This is what is called private property, free enterprise, and earn their living through the payment of wages as well. A capitalist economy, in other words. Okay? So there is this idea of freedom embedded in those terminologies, in which we have political freedom, the freedom to, vote, for example, and have certain liberties and rights, but also economic freedom, the freedom to participate in the economy, own property, and make money, in other words. Okay? That is the idea, or the fundamental premise of the American model. Now, it is precisely at the end of the Cold War that we see that this American model was also predicated on the idea that it was necessary to spread this model around the world. And the way to spread this model around the world was by influencing other countries, if you will, to open their doors and open also their minds to the possibility of becoming just like the United States, in other words. This was known as the motion to open world economies. Okay? We need to open up world economies, in other words. The economies of nations need to be open, in other words, to American interest, American goods, American cultural ideas, American investment, American capital, and the like. Remember, this is the time when Americans were moving now outwards as well. This internationalism that I just mentioned, this triple alliance of the 1930s that I just explained. So this involved, again, nations signing treaties in order to trade with the United States, to implement what is called free market, to open up their markets instead of closing their markets to the world. They wanted those nations to open up their markets to the world and engage in free trade. In other words, the free flow of goods coming from without, the imports, in other words. Okay, so remember, this is a time when the United States is trying to export more and more around the world. So it needs free trade agreements to open up the world's economies, if you will. And remember, this is not just, opening up the economies for American goods to pour into those countries, but also American cultural ideas, as I will explain in just a few moments. That also called for ending protectionism, this idea that nations are going to protect their own industries by erecting barriers, shields, in other words, that prevent imports, or placing high tariffs on imports. That, look, we need to end protectionism. Nations must lower their tariffs or abolish them and engage in free trade. So we will then invest capital in those countries and also bring in finance loans as well. Again, those are American banks extending loans into other countries that are going to be used in order to invest it in fostering, for example, industrial production or agricultural production and the like. Again, so this is the American system. This is what during the Cold War, the United States was advertising, that in order to really achieve modernity, you need to open your doors, in other words, okay, for American investors, American financiers, and also American manufactured goods as well. And as I mentioned, it was also a way to start influencing those societies around the world, to start thinking more and more in terms of American ideas and values. Again, that it is important to export the American way of thinking, the American way of doing things, and the like around the world, that we need an exchange of ideas. And most importantly, what this really centered on was the idea that through this, that we're going to create the environment in other societies in which people are going to start valuing more and more the idea of consumption or consumerism. That the ultimate purpose of modernity, achieving modernization and transformation for any society, is for people to create what is called a consumer paradise. A paradise of consumers, in other words, that people are going to enjoy so much economic success, economic affluence, that they're going to spend their earnings, their incomes, their monies on the consumption of goods and services, and they're going to live lives that are very fulfilling, very entertaining, and they're going to enjoy themselves to the fullest. That this is what, again, the system is promising. This is the ideal society. This is the utopian society that we are promoting. Again, that the American system is promoting. Yeah, the consumer paradise. So it's important to also exchange ideas, because through those ideas, people are going to start thinking about, again, and valuing, in this case, consumerism, in other words, okay? To be lured, to be attracted to the lavish, for example, lifestyles that Americans live, the kind of automobiles that they drive, the kind of homes that they live in, and so on, the suburbs in which they live as well, the entertainment venues, etc. And all of that comes, again, through advertisement, through commercial ads, and so on, television, films, movies, magazines. Again, those are the kinds of ideas that are going to be fundamental in shaping the way people think, again, about their own societies and how to attain fulfillment. Now, in 1947, in the United States, we see the formation also of certain capitalist institutions, international capitalist institutions in this case, This came during a meeting, otherwise known as the Bretton Woods Agreement. It was a meeting that took place in the United States of very important financiers, particularly financiers, but also industrialists that are really creating international. Again, we're seeing now internationalism. Remember, we were talking about that. International capitalist institutions in order to foster development around the world and trying to shape the direction that countries are taking, particularly trying to gear them into this path of American-style modernization. We see the creation, for example, of the World Bank, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, for example, another very critical institution, and also the GATT, as it was called, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade. Now, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund will be providing loans to nations that are trying to achieve modernity or to solve sometimes critical crises, emergencies, for example, like emergency loans and so on. But most importantly, those are loans that nations borrow in order to use those loans in order to achieve modernization, like build roads, for example, ports or airports. Now we're talking about airports as well. For trade, to invest them on agricultural technologies or industrial facilities and the like. That is the idea, that you're trying to lend nations for them to start, again, industrializing and creating a kind of capitalist economy. And the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade is trying to also influence nations to end protectionism. That is the idea. Promote free trade and trying to get countries, the countries that are members of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, to start lowering their taxes on imports, their tariffs, in other words. That was the idea. Okay, so we see the formation of international institutions that are there precisely to spread the American model. Now, it is really at the outset of the Cold War that we see particularly Western Europe tying its economy with the United States, and we see a kind of American/European integration of sorts. This occurred when Europeans appealed for help to the United States in terms of borrowing money or receiving aid, in this case, for the European economies to rebuild and reconstruct. And again, this came in the form of the Marshall Plan. The United States gave Europe $12.5 billion to rebuild their countries, to rebuild their highways, their factories from the Second World War. In other words, to rebuild their economies in order to prevent a communist takeover, again, of Western Europe. Again, because, Western Europe was threatened by the Soviet Union. It was communism that was advancing into Western Europe. And in order to kind of shield, if you will, Western Europe from the communist advance, the United States kind of went in and infused massive amount of monies and capital into the Western European economy. And by doing that, the European economy became kind of tied to the American economy. We can see that Europe is becoming, at least Western Europe, an extension of the U.S. economy. We can see that with the creation of a multilateral military alliance that came in the form of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in 1949. And that is Western European countries and the United States, along with Canada, are now building a defense system, a defense alliance, to defend themselves from the Soviet Union and their allies as well. Again, so this defense alliance, it's called NATO, is also consolidating the American-European integration, because it's not just that we see a military alliance bringing those regions together, but rather, again, the American system is rapidly spreading into Western Europe as well. American goods are now flowing into Europe. Again, Europeans are purchasing American industrial goods, but also defense spending as well. That then this alliance also required, building bases as well in Europe, and the Europeans also purchasing, of course, military equipment, military technologies from the United States, and this is again creating what is called defense spending. So again, we see the economic integration again of Europe and North America. As you can see here, the NATO countries are the ones in the West, the blue countries, and they're trying to contain communism, which was fostered and largely expanded by the Soviet Union. Again, so let's look in this case at the Soviet model. This is yet another kind of world that the Soviets propose. This is how you achieve modernity. They're trying to modernize as well, but instead of doing it through capitalism, the Soviets propose yet a second world, a second type of world. So human beings born during this time on planet Earth, born in any of the communist countries that are part of the Soviet system, are born into an entirely different world, so to speak, okay? In which, first and foremost, here we don't have political freedom, okay? People live under a totalitarian state. Again, they're governed by a one-party state, which is the Communist Party, and the leader of the party is really the ruler or dictator of the country. So again, it's a very top-down kind of structure, very rigid. So we don't have, for example, civil liberties. We don't have Bill of Rights. We don't have elections as well. It's just the Communist Party that is in charge. And the economy, also, there is no social mobility. In communist countries, people are not divided into social classes, so to speak. Like in capitalism, we have a working class, a middle class, and an upper class. And you can move up and down depending on your luck or depending on your merit, your discipline, your effort, your work, whatever. But here, again, we see a horizontal kind of society in which there's no room to go up and down. It's horizontal. In capitalism, it's more vertical. Okay, it's like a pyramid with classes, again, ranked one upon the other. But in communism, it's a more horizontal system, again, in which there's no social mobility up or down. Okay. So this is a totally different world, again, that people are born into. And the economy, as I mentioned, is communism in that there's no social classes and the state runs the entire economy. All sectors of the economy are run by the state. Okay, state planning, for example. The state plans every aspect of society, and everybody works for the state as well. There's no private property too. Even though you might be running a factory, you might be running a shop, that shop ultimately is not really yours. It's the state's, in other words, okay? So the state is the ultimate owner of everything, and everybody really works for the state, and the state plans, the economy in terms of how many units of production people are producing and so on. The state is doing all of that again. So the idea that, people are in charge of their own businesses, determining what to produce, what not to produce, how many units to produce, all of that is virtually non-existent under communist systems. Yeah, so in the Soviet system, what we see is that agriculture, for example, between 1929 and 1935 was collectivized. In the past, there was some private ownership of farms. But now, under Stalin, what Stalin did was to collectivize agriculture. In other words, he removed private property from the agricultural sector. And so now the land belongs to the peasants, but the peasants must work for the state. In other words, so that nobody owns their farm anymore. The farm lands are owned in common. Everybody is the owner, so to speak, but ultimately everybody works for the state. In other words, so again, the dictates of the state must be followed in order to feed the country. Yes, there's no private property, but at the same time, we got, of course, on top of the economy, Stalin, who is really directing the economy, and he owns pretty much, the economy. Okay. It was largely up to this point, the Soviet Union still largely an agricultural society, but what we see, for example, 1930, from the 1930 to the 1940s, the Soviet Union is trying to rapidly industrialize. This is something that Russia in the 19th century was attempting to do. We looked at that in the past. Again, the attempts to industrialize in places like, Moscow or St. Petersburg. But now there's going to be massive industrialization taking place during those decades. And what really accelerated this process was the Second World War. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, Stalin really placed industrialization into full gear, top priority, and we see the massive expansion of industrial plants across the Soviet Union. And it is precisely because of the Second World War, when the Nazis, occupied great portions of the Soviet Union, and most of the battles of the Second World War actually took place inside of the Soviet Union between the Nazis and the Soviets. It is precisely because of that the Soviet Union is going to rise up also to the world stage as the second largest industrial power. The first one was the United States by far, but a close second was the Soviet Union. And the Second World War was also a critical factor for transforming the Soviet Union into this massive, massive industrial power as well. Now, the Soviet model is not necessarily advertising a consumer paradise. Okay, because once again, there's no private property or free enterprise, inside of the Soviet Union. So this is not really ripe for creating a society of consumers. Again, this is not what the Soviet model actually presents to the world. What they're actually presenting to the world is the idea that you can create a society in which you create the ideal conditions for the industrial working class instead, not for a middle class that will enjoy their life through the consumption of goods and services, but rather the industrial worker. Now, the industrial worker is not going to be rich. Okay? It's not really going to be well off. It's not going to live a lavish lifestyle with affluence, with entertainment venues, etc. No. But rather that the industrial worker is going to be taken care of by the state. That the state is going to really provide all the essentials for the worker. Again, so they are offering, instead of the consumer paradise, the Soviet model is offering a worker's paradise in this case. Okay? For example, guaranteeing jobs, that there will be no unemployment, for example. That the state will always find some form of job or employment for you to do. Housing as well will be provided, retirement. It will provide education and the like. Again, so this is not really a consumer paradise, but rather just a worker's paradise, in other words. Okay? So it's a whole different utopia than the American utopia. That is more of a middle class paradise, the American utopia, but here is more of like a worker's utopia, in other words. Okay? And just like the United States integrated Western Europe into its system, into its military, for example, defense system, and also trade system, the Soviet Union did likewise with Eastern Europe as well. It really integrated the Eastern European countries into its own economy, communist economy into its own political sphere of influence as well. And this came in the form of an alliance as well called the Warsaw Pact, signed in 1955. Again, in which Eastern Europe is integrated into the Soviet bloc. And what we see now is really the division, once again, of the world between two different systems. The American, along with Western Europe, and now the Soviet, along with Eastern Europe. Both offering very different roads to modernity, to modernization. Now, China, although followed the communist path, we talked about China in the past when we we're looking at world revolutions. It's very important to note that China offered yet a different model of communism that was very different and distinct from the Soviet model. It was more of a peasant communism. Remember that the Soviets are creating a kind of like a workers' paradise, okay? Workers' communism in this case. The industrial worker in this case. But China is still largely a peasant nation. The vast majority of the Chinese population are peasants. And so the kind of communism that we're going to get to see for most of the Cold War is a kind of peasant communism, in which what China is trying to create is a kind of ideal society, a paradise for peasants. Peasants have been oppressed for not only hundreds of years, but thousands of years by large landowners, by bureaucrats, by the Mandarin, for example, class, by emperors, and so on. They were forced to pay tribute. In many cases, they were driven off their lands. Particularly in the 19th century, many peasants lost their livelihoods when the lands were privatized in order for the development of commercial farms in China. So again, the Chinese Communist Revolution appealed to the peasants because they were really the majority of the dispossessed inside of China, and they were going to constitute really the bulk of the communist army in the communist revolution. So therefore, significant concessions had to be made to the peasants in terms of, land distribution. So we see the collectivization of lands in terms of land distribution to the peasantry and the elimination of the landowners. Again, so all the landowners across China lost their properties. The state confiscated those properties and distributed those lands to the peasantry. Again, so here what we see is that the peasants are now in charge, so to speak, of their own lands. And of course, just like in the Soviet Union, they do have to produce for the country. So they are working for the state because they have to feed the country, by the way. But again, the land has been collectivized. Now, China is also going to set the stage for industrialization as well. Okay, they are trying to catch up with the West to a certain degree, and they're interested in developing certain industries, particularly heavy industries like steel and railroads. And they're beginning to do that throughout the 1950s. We see heavy investment, again, in creating those kinds of industrial plants and massive railroads and the like across China. The problem, however, is that in the creation of those industries, we started looking at the emergence of hierarchies within those industries. Not necessarily social classes. It's not like there's an industrial working class, a middle class, and the upper class. But rather that what we see is that we're creating distinctions between the workforce, the industrial workers, and the managers. Now, the educated elite, in other words, those that are sitting in offices, doing the planning, the analysis, that they are becoming like leaders, like the ones that we see, for example, in capitalist countries in the West. And again, this is going to be problematic, particularly for Mao, the dictator of the People's Republic of China, Communist China, in that he wanted to eliminate hierarchies from Chinese society altogether. He wanted a communist economy, a communist society, but without any hierarchies anywhere. So in order to accomplish this, Mao set in motion a new plan to start revamping China to achieve economic development, but without the creation of hierarchies. This was known as the Great Leap Forward. Again, this is a massive national project to really spur development in China without creating any kind of hierarchy whatsoever. Mao wanted to create what he called a new man, a new person altogether in China. That this revolution was not just about creating communism, it was really about creating a new kind of human being. In other words, a new kind of human being that will think about, for example, collectivism. What do we mean about collectivism? Yes, that the economy at large and all the resources and all the economy is owned in common, that everybody is working to benefit the whole, in other words, collectivism. This is very, very different from individualism, for example. He did not want the Chinese person to think about themselves as individuals, but rather a member of the collective, that all your work is for the benefit of all, that you're working to supply the needs of all the people of China. So this is very, very consistent with the kinship form of social organization that China has had for thousands of years. China for thousands of years had developed this social identity that China itself is a gigantic network of extended families, in other words, and clans that are all, interlinked through common history, common ancestors, that they're just one big family, in other words. So Mao is kind of trying to revive that kind of worldview inside of China for people to see themselves more as a collective, in other words, that this is a massive extended family, in other words. So we need to cooperate with one another, and we need to also see each other as equal. That there will be no distinctions, in other words, inside of China between, again, elites and workers or peasants. Again, this is an egalitarian society. Again, so they're trying to sponsor, that kind of worldview in this great leap forward. To do this, to eliminate hierarchies, he's really trying to sponsor what is called rural industrialization. Establishing what is called backyard blast furnaces, small furnaces in backyards in rural communities, which peasants are going to be in charge of and operating. So we don't create those massive industrial plants that are in need of industrial managers, for example, and supervisors that will become like an elite force. In order to prevent that, what we need smaller factories, smaller furnaces in the countryside, for example, in the backyard, across China. Yeah, he's trying to eliminate, in other words, hierarchies. Sponsoring people's communes in the countryside. In other words, nested communities of peasants that are going to be, working together to produce the food to feed their own provinces, their own regions, but also to feed the country as a whole. Again, so people are placed to work in small nested communities, once again, commune. What Mao also wants to do is have people living in the urban centers, for example, workers in industrial plants, like the supervisors and the managers, the professional managerial class, for example, and the intellectuals, educators, university professors with PhDs, to step aside from their work and to spend some time in the countryside. They're going to be forced to live with the peasants and to work with the peasants, to be a peasant, in other words. So they will understand that this is what a peasant goes through, the peasants work the land, they're feeding the country, and this is a very humbling experience that everybody must understand. So in order to prevent people falling into this elitist mentality, those that are more prone to fall into that are the kind of westernizers, in other words, of China, will be forced to move into the countryside, to spend a lot of time there as well. Again, so this is, again, a very difficult project to achieve. It was not very successful. As a matter of fact, by the 1960s, it proved to be a failure. It did not really achieve the results that Mao wanted. As a matter of fact, it set off a series of catastrophes, particularly famine. Millions of people are going to die as a result of that. So this was not achievable. It was a utopian dream that he had in mind that he wanted to implement, but again, it was not feasible, in other words. In other areas, Mao is going to have a little bit more success, for example, providing free education and also health services for all people. So the state is providing, once again, guaranteed education and health services, and also women's rights, also improved during this period of time compared to, let's say, previous times when women really had absolutely no rights whatsoever. Not at all. Okay, so those were perhaps the two areas where we see, some significant improvement. Okay, now besides the American model, the Soviet and the Chinese models, remember, those are different worlds. They are indeed presenting different ways for people to live and experience life here on Earth. There's going to be yet another area, and that is the third world. Okay, the third world is yet another area of the world that is going to offer a quite different life experience, a different kind of experience in terms of the political system, the economic system, for example, society at large will be quite different from, let us say, the United States, the Soviet Union, including China. And because they were very distinct and different from the first and second worlds, the first world of capitalism and the second world of communism, this area will be known during the Cold War as the third world, the third way, in other words. Total different model of development. Now, for the most part, third world countries were countries that were situated in the southern part of the globe. So this is known as the Global South, in other words. What you see here in this map, again, is the third world. The area of red, as you can see, is mostly South America, including Central America and Mexico, the whole continent of Africa as well, the Middle East, India, Southeast Asia, for example. The Global South. And one of the reasons why the Global South became known as the Third World was because this is a region that was colonized by Europe. Some of them had been earning their independence from European powers since the 19th century, like the Latin American countries, that they earned their independence from Spain and Portugal, for example. So because those were newly created nations, they were determining in the 20th century which kind of path to follow. They wanted to know which path of development they were going to follow, the capitalist path or the communist path. They needed to build an economic system. They needed to build one. And they were presented with that option. And as we'll see, they're going to, instead of following capitalism or communism, they're going to create their own path, as we'll see. And most of the struggles of the Cold War, meaning the real struggles of the Cold War, was not really the United States and the Soviet Union fighting each other directly, but rather their struggle was to gain converts and followers in the third world, trying to convince third world countries, trying to influence them in so many different ways to either adopt the capitalist path or the communist path. So again, so the third world will be caught in the middle of the crossfire of the Cold War. As we'll see, we don't have the time to go over that because we ran out of time. But when we come back, we're going to continue looking at the Cold War. And after we do that, we're going to cover the last portion of this topic that is going to deal with the rise of neoliberalism, for example. This idea that we need to spread global capitalism around the world. We're going to look at that. And also at the end, we're going to look at some of the crises of globalization towards the end. Okay, this is all I have for you. I'll see you then in session 3 when we come back. Thank you.